Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to Horizons.
Welcome.
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 Hey, life changers, welcome to Horizons.
So this video shows us some real fears that we all face, right? You probably can relate to some of those fears that you saw in that quick video there. But I think we can also have some pretty silly fears as well. And so I'm gonna tell you about one of my silly fears. I don't know if I really want to tell you this, but it's gonna happen, I guess. So one of my greatest fears came about while I was in middle school. And I was at the lake one day, and we went to the lake to, we did a lot of boating and stuff like that with some friends, and specifically on this day, we were going to the lake for one of my friend's birthday parties, and we were tubing behind the boat, and so this was kind of a big deal because in middle school was like the first time where we had the boys and girls parties together. It's kind of like that next phase in life. You're like, all right, this is cool. Like, I'm nervous, but this is good. So we're tubing, and this fun game that we would play was to see how long you could hold onto the tube, right? I think that's probably the game most of the time you go tubing, but specifically this day, it was pretty crazy. I was holding on for dear life, and my friend's dad was driving the boat. And like in his mind, he's like doing everything to get us off as soon as possible. So you can imagine how he's driving the boat. And so we are tubing. I'm hanging on for dear life. I'm on this round and trying not to get thrown off this tube. I mean, we were going so fast that like I remember it still. Like when we would hit when we go in the right direction, we'd hit the wind the right way. Like the tube would start to like float off the water. We were going that fast. And I was hanging on as long as I could because probably longer than I should have been too, because being a middle school boy, the girls were there. I had to impress the girls, right? So I had to hold on. My arms were killing me. Finally, I couldn't make it any longer, and I eventually rolled off the tube and my body was skipping across the water. Like a stone, like somebody skipping a stone across the water. It was not fun. But I finally came to a stop. I'm exhausted. My arms, my hands they're hurting. I can't move. And I'm just floating there waiting for the boat to come back around and pick me up. You would think that my fear comes from tubing, right? After skipping across the water, but that's not where my story ends today. That's not where my fear comes from, unfortunately. The boat comes back around, and you try to get up. What's the deal with those ladders on the boat? Like, you're already exhausted, and it's got like 2 rungs on it, and you have to pull. You basically have to like army crawl up the back of the boat. So I'm doing that, and as I get up, I'm struggling to pull myself up, and emerging from the water, and I start to feel the breeze hit my skin on my leg a little higher than it should be. And as I look down, I'm standing in front of all my friends. Remember, first boys and girls party here in middle school. And I see that my swimming trunks have split on one side of my swimming trunks from the bottom all the way up to my waistband. They hadn't completely come off, which was a miracle, but they were pretty close. So I grabbed a towel as fast as I could and wrapped that around me for the rest of the day. And so to this day, I have a fear that whenever I go tubing or water skiing, like if I don't really cinch my shorts up nice and tight, they're gonna be gone. So, right, we have these silly fears in our lives, but they're fears nonetheless, right? And I think a lot of us probably have more serious fears than that as well. But I thought that today, the day that we're honoring our seniors was a great day to talk about this topic of the fear of the future. And so as our seniors are getting ready to kind of embark on this next journey in their lives and move into a new stage, that can be pretty scary. We've all been there. Most of us have been there, right? Like where we're moving to that next phase. And it's pretty scary. And maybe not only for them, but for their parents as well. It can be pretty scary moving into that. And it's also ironic today that I'm talking about fear while I'm up here talking and doing something that most people fear the most, right? Talking in front of a large group of people. But even if you aren't struggling, with fear right now, you've experienced fear before in your life. All of us have, right? We know what it feels like to be fearful. And so it's something that we all have experienced. We all know what it feels like. If you're me, like you see some people that don't have fear and you think like, what is going on with those people? These are the people that have, I don't know if this is gonna work, Justin, probably not. These are the people that have that sticker on their car. If you've ever seen that, I might be dating myself. I don't think these exist anymore, but they did when I was in high school. But you see these no fear stickers on cars, like these are people I stayed away from, right? Like I feared these people because if you don't have fear, my thought is like, what's wrong with you? You're not afraid of anything? Like I'm staying away from you. But because we know, I think we all know that fear can be a good thing as well. Fear can be a good thing. We teach our kids not to play in traffic because, to fear getting in the street because we don't want them to get hit by a car. We probably fear that too. We don't want to go into a busy street. Maybe it's the fear within relationship. Maybe it's a fear has kept us from a relationship that would maybe be good for our life. A friend relationship or whatever that might be. Electricity. Like I don't mess with electricity at my house because I'm fearful that I'm going to get electrocuted. That's probably a good thing because if I mess with it, if something's wrong, I don't know anything about it. So some fear is good, but maybe for you, fear consumes you in your life. And if this is you, today's message might help you a little bit with that. But if fear and anxiety is something that controls your daily life, you might need to seek some professional help for that, and that's okay. This message today is specifically geared toward all that other 80% of fear that we all kind of deal with on an everyday basis. And so we're going to start today by talking about what fear is. I want to define fear. Fear is an emotion. Okay, fear is an emotion. We're gonna kind of talk about it as an emotion today, and so it's something we feel, right? And we experience this more today, I think, than we ever have before, especially our students. Our students experience this more today than ever before. I think we do as a society, we face this more and more every day today because we're more aware of everything, right? With technology, with social media, with everything easily one click away, we know more, right? We know more about everything going on, and sometimes that's not good, right? Sometimes knowing less is better. And so I think that it's this emotion, and this emotion is caused by this belief of some looming potential loss. So there's something out there in the future that's going to cause harm or pain to us or to somebody we love, and it's just based on this future loss, something that we could potentially lose. So what's the problem with that? What's the problem with fear? The problem becomes when it starts to control us, because I think it can. It can control us in our actions and what we do and don't do. And so when you think about it this way, what has fear kept you from doing, right? Fear has maybe kept you from new ideas, from trying something different, trying something new. Fear has maybe kept you from applying for that job, or it's kept you from a relationship. And it's what it's starting to do, or what it can do, is it can limit our ability to experience life. But we have to think of the other side too. What has fear caused you to do? Because it can cause us to do some things too. And it's probably caused, I know it's caused me things to do, things that I've done that I wish I wouldn't have. So I think it can sometimes cause us to do things we wish we wouldn't have. You know, if we fear, middle school is the big one, high school too can be the fear of not fitting in, right? Even as adults, I think we struggle with that, right? The fear of not fitting into a certain group or a certain place. And so when we fear that, we maybe do things that we regret or we wish we wouldn't. But today, what I'm here to tell you is that everyone has the opportunity to overcome fear. And there is a part of all of us that's fearless. And to do that, to overcome fear, it starts with understanding fear. We have to understand fear because that's the first step to overcoming it. And so we got to know what it is. We got to know, why is it here? We have to take a step back and look at, okay, why am I fearful of this? And we've got to understand it to move past it. And so to do that, I have this feararchy, play on words there on hierarchy, yes, that we're going to look at today that kind of breaks up some different categories of fear that we probably all deal with or have dealt with at some point. So the first one on there is extinction, and the second one is autonomy. We're going to talk about each one of these. The third one is separation, and the fourth one is ego. So when we think about these, when we think about extinction, for example, that's exactly what you think it is, like being extinct, right? We are afraid of death. We're afraid that, we're someday going to die. And all of these are based off of those future losses, right? We have to keep that in mind. All of these categories of fear are based off those future losses, those potential losses that are out there in the future. So extinction simply means death, right? That's why some people are afraid of snakes, poisonous snakes. They're just creepy sometimes too, right? Heights, we have people that maybe fear heights because we're afraid of falling off those heights, right? Flying, I still to this day cannot understand why something so big can stay in the air. I don't know. I know it's science, but that's one of my fears. Autonomy is talking about the fear of, or is talking about control, right? Autonomy is having control or being able to have control over everything. And so we have fears associated with this when it comes to economic loss, thinking about the stock market. We don't have complete control over that. And so we think about the future and we kind of worry about that stuff. Or it could be, this kind of leads to people hoarding things or keeping things because something in the future might cause us to not have or be able to get something. So we need to keep hold of that. We need to store it up. So this causes some people to not drive, right? I can control what's in my car and how I'm driving, but I can't control everybody else. And then also we talk about, for our students, the right school, right? They have a little bit of control over what school they get into, but ultimately that's not completely in their control. And so sometimes that scares us. When we talk about the fear of separation, we're talking about being separate from somebody, being taken away from somebody, or somebody being taken away from us. This can show up in fear of being single, fear of being alone, the fear of divorce, the loss, being separated from a loved one, the loss of a loved one. We fear these, and students, you probably have said this in your head, if not out loud. Why are my parents so overprotective? Like, why don't they let me do anything? It's because we're scared that we're going to be separated from you, right? For permanently. So, just take it easy on them, right? But that's where these fears come from. The one on the top here is our ego. The fear of failing. Fear of feeling insignificant. Fear of being humiliated. And this is, I think, where public speaking comes into play, right? We're afraid we're going to get up there and not say anything or say the wrong thing. Jerry Seinfeld actually, he has a joke about the ego, the speaking in public. He goes, he talks about how more people fear public speaking than they do death. And his punchline in his joke is that people would rather be in the casket than giving the speech at the funeral, right? And I think sometimes that's true. We build that fear up so much. And so when we look at these are all of these fears. Most of all of our fears can fit into these categories. And so when we see this, you can see that how fear becomes this thing that's seeking control in our life. And so what do we need to do? First, we need to understand it, like we talked about. And so once we can disassociate from fear, we can begin to see it for what it is and deal with it how we should. So once we are able to take a step back and understand where that fear is coming from, then we can deal with it. The more we understand it, the less it frightens us, and the less it can control us. There's something else, though, that we need to overcome our fear. So the first thing is to understand it. And this second thing is it's one word that is used over and over throughout history, and throughout biblical history as well. The thing about it is it seems like a weird word to use, and you wouldn't think of it, and that word's love. The love that our Creator has for us. You wouldn't probably think about that when first talking about overcoming fear necessarily, but I'm going to talk just a little bit about how that is and how that helps us. If you know John at all, John followed Jesus. John followed Jesus very closely, and John called himself the one who Jesus loved. Like, that's a bold statement, right? To say you're the one that Jesus loved. But John had a little bit to say about this idea of fear and love. And in 1 John 4:18, he says this. He says, there is no fear in love. And what John's talking about here, I think, is this God kind of love that's not based on a performance. It's not based on whether we can earn it or not. It's just freely given to us. And it's this perfect love that John's talking about, this perfect love, because he continues to say here that, but perfect love drives out all fear. And so it's this perfect love of God that leaves no room for fear, because with that love, there's no room for fear. Paul also talks about this love after several years of making changes in his life. If you know anything about Paul, Paul he's a pretty rough guy. He's not poetic at all, I don't think. And in his life, he'd been whipped, chained, beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and falsely accused most of his life. So even once while he was shipwrecked, he was setting up a campfire, and as he's setting up the campfire, he gets bit by a snake. I mean, come on, right? This guy can't win. Like, he can't catch a break. He knows all about fear. He lived in fear most of his life, probably. And yet, look at what he has to say about this fear and this love of Christ. He says this in Romans 8:35-36. He said, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? And he's talking about the love of Christ, right? What Christ did for us on the cross. He went to the cross for us, for our sake. And Paul continues by saying, should trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, or nakedness, that's me in the tube, hopefully not ever, or danger or sword. Paul says, no, as it is written, for your sake we face death all day long, and we're considered as sheep to be slaughtered. But he says, no, in all these things, we're more than conquerors through him who loved us. So you and I can become more than a conqueror who can overcome our fear with this love of Christ. And so when we look back at our feararchy, and we look at this love side of things, God speaks to all of these fears. He's already spoken into all of these fears that we have. You know, to our ego, God says you matter. He says it over and over again. He cares deeply about you. If we're fearful of failing, of feeling insignificant, he says you matter. And when it comes to separation, feeling single, or being single, alone, feeling divorced, fear of those things, God says, I'll never leave. He promises he'll never leave. He doesn't say we won't go through those things, but he promises that he'll never leave us, right? to autonomy, to that feeling of control, he says, trust me, right? Trust me. Have faith in me. Trust me. You've heard the song, Jesus Take the Wheel, right? He means it. Trust me. And then when he speaks into extinction as well by saying, and the stats are out there. 1 out of 1, we're all going to die. Sorry. But we're all going to die someday. But God speaks into that by saying, I defeated death, right? I went to a cross, I died, I was buried, but hey, guess what? I walked out of the grave 3 days later. I defeated death. And so fear can have no reign in our life. And so what then shall we say in response to these? This is what Paul then says about all this, kind of to sum it all up. He says, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who could be against us? And then so fear, like I said, has no reign as long as God's love is raining down on me and in our life. So in other words, if God is for me, there's no fear that can rule me. If God is for you, there's no fear that can rule you. And the interesting thing about God's love, like this perfect love, is God's love doesn't just defeat fear. Like God's love obliterates fear. Like it knocks it out of the park, right? And so when we look at this, right, the first thing is understanding it. You've got to understand the fear and where it comes from. Overcoming fear begins with understanding this love that God has for us, but it also begins with embracing it. It's one thing to understand it, right, and to know about this love that God's talking about, or that Paul's talking about, that God has for us. It's another thing to take it from our head to our heart, right, to embrace it. And so in a biography about that was written about a guy named Jimmy Iovine, I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but if you don't know who he is, he's one of the greatest music producers of all time. He engineered and produced music for people like John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, U2, and many, many more people. And he talks about in his biography, it talks about his like making it big moment. And so he got a call from his boss on a Sunday. He was an intern at a company, and so he gets a call from his boss on a Sunday, and his boss is asking him to come in. Hey, we need you to come in. We've got an artist that wants to record, or that needs to record today. And Jimmy was with his family. They were going to mass, and he's like, I can't make it in, but his boss just kept hounding him, like, hey, we need you in. We need you in here. And so finally, Jimmy kind of breaks down, and he goes in. He goes into work, and his boss asks him that day, as he's an intern, he says, are you ready to move into the engineer seat today? Like, we need you to step up and produce this music today, or with this artist. And Jimmy's like, yeah, I think I'm ready. I can do that. I'm ready for that. And so Jimmy goes in, and that day in walks John Lennon from the Beatles, right? Like, I know, look them up if you don't know them, students, the Beatles. But he walks in, and he doesn't, in the biography, the author of the biography asks Jimmy, like, how did you have the confidence that day to produce music for John Lennon, right? This is your first time producing music, sitting in that engineer chair. And Jimmy says, like, I don't know how I had the confidence to do that, but he just remembered something his dad would always tell him. And his dad always told Jimmy that when he walked in the room was better because he was in it. And so I want everybody in here to know today that you have a Father in heaven who believes the room is better because you walked in the room, because you're in the room. And if you believe that, fear won't win anymore. It can't win if you truly believe that. Because God's love gives fear something to fear. It's so powerful. It says, hey, darkness, I'm bringing light. Hey, shadow, there's nothing that you could ever deny. Hey, fear, there's a love so powerful that you'll never win. And so students, as you prepare to depart from friends you've grown up with, or be far away from your parents and family, and that fear begins to set in, I want to encourage you to recite these words, that God is for me, no fear can rule me. And just keep that in your mind and repeat that over and over. Or when you sit in your first class and feel completely overwhelmed, or you take that first test and you feel like you were really unprepared for it, just think, God is for me, no fear can rule me. Or maybe it's when you're starting your first adult job after you graduate and you start to feel afraid if you're going to make it. Or maybe you don't quite have the next leg of your journey figured out completely. And that's scary to you. Just remember, God is for me, no fear can rule me. We all can use those words, right? We can all use those, whether it's fear of death, of losing a job, of being alone, of divorce, of failure, or of feeling insignificant. Because once we embrace God's perfect love, we can truly believe that God is for me, because no fear can rule me. The worship team is going to lead us in a special song just in a minute here, declaring this perfect love of God. And as they sing this, I want us all to just sit and let these words speak into your heart today. In the song, you're going to hear that it talks about how, we no longer are slave to fear because we are children of God, because we're a child of God. And that our fears are drowned out in perfect love. If you take nothing else away from today, I want you to remember this, because this, I think, is key. Is that you have a Father in heaven who believes the room is better because you're in the room. Well, let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much for bringing that perfect love into our life, God, that we can embrace your perfect love in our hearts and not worry about our fears, our worries, our anxieties of the future, because we know and we have hope in you and all that you have in store for us. God, we just pray today that you would, again, just walk with these students. Let them know, let them believe that fear can't rule them, because you are so powerful and you have a love for them that we can't even explain fully, God. Thank you so much for them and their life change, and we're excited to see how you're going to move through them in the future. And be with us all today as we think about fears that we have of the future, and hold on to that hope and trust you and believe in you, because to you we all matter. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.